The men coming ashore at Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944, described the sound before they described anything else. Not gunfire, not explosions, something they had no reference for. A long tearing rip, like canvas being split at speed, or the air itself being cut apart. One veteran called it a zipper. Another said it sounded like the world cracking open. But here is what made it worse. Most of them heard it before they saw anything at all, because the landing craft ramps were still up, and the men inside had maybe 4 seconds to process what was waiting for them before those ramps dropped and turned everyone at the front of the boat into casualties. That sound was the MG42, and by the time most of those men could identify it, several of them were already dead. The MG42 fired at approximately 1,200 rounds per minute. Some configurations pushed past 1,500. The American M1919 Browning, which Allied troops considered a capable machine gun, fired at around 400 to 600 rounds per minute. The British Bren topped out at 500, the Soviet Maxim at 600. But listen to this. The MG42 wasn't just faster than those weapons. It was operating in a different category entirely. At maximum rate, it was releasing more than 20 rounds per second. By the time a human nervous system registered the beginning of a burst, the burst was already over. The weapon didn't sound like individual shots because individual shots were not what it was producing. It was producing a continuous mechanical roar, a tearing sound, because the human ear could not distinguish one round from the next at that speed. The Germans called it the Heereswaffe, the army's weapon. Allied soldiers had their own names for it: Hitler's buzzsaw, the bone saw. The names were not poetic, they were accurate, and the reason those names stuck is not difficult to understand. What the gun did to human tissue at 300 meters was something that soldiers who witnessed it struggled to describe without reaching for the language of machinery rather than wounds. This is the part that gets discussed in terms of firepower, suppression capability, and tactical doctrine. But that conversation misses something important. The MG42 on D-Day was everywhere, and it was devastating. The men behind it, the gunners, the loaders, the assistant gunners responsible for barrel changes and ammunition feeds, almost none of them survived the day. Not at Omaha. Not at the positions that mattered. The question is not why the MG42 was lethal. That is self-evident from the rate of fire alone. The question is why the men operating the most dominant weapon on the battlefield that morning had one of the shortest life expectancies on either side of the wire. To understand what happened to the gunners, it is necessary to understand what they were defending and where they were placed. The Atlantic Wall was not a single fortification. It was a network of widerstandsnester, resistance nests strung along the coast of occupied Europe from Norway to the Bay of Biscay. At Omaha Beach, these positions had been built over years, reinforced, redesigned, and integrated into overlapping fields of fire that, on paper, made any amphibious assault unsustainable. The reason those positions were so effective is less obvious than it first appears. The guns were not facing straight out to sea. They were angled, deliberately. The positions fired parallel to the beach, enfilading the shoreline from concrete emplacements cut into the bluffs at either end of the sector. A landing craft that dropped its ramp and discharged men into the surf was not presenting a frontal target to the nearest machine gun nest. It was presenting a broadside to positions several hundred meters down the beach. That geometry was precise and calculated. The Germans had walked those fields of fire, fired ranging shots, and marked distances to natural features that landing troops would instinctively use for cover. The shingle bank at the high tide line, the beach obstacles the engineers had planted, the draws in the bluffs that led off the beach, which became killing grounds precisely because everyone who reached the shingle eventually started moving toward them. The MG42 crews had been living with that terrain for months, some of them considerably longer. WN62, Wider Stands Nest 62, sat at the eastern edge of the Easy Red sector at Omaha. It housed multiple machine gun positions, mortars, and an artillery piece. Of all the positions at Omaha, WN62 is the one military historians return to most often because the accounting from that position is specific in a way that most accounts from that morning are not. And the reason that specificity exists traces back to one man. Heinrich Sevelow was an 18-year-old farm laborer from Lower Saxony. He had not been trained as a machine gunner. He had been assigned to an artillery regiment. On the morning of June 6th, he was behind an MG42 in a position overlooking the beach, and over the course of several hours, he fired an estimated 12,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition and an additional 400 rifle rounds. The accounts conflict on the specific figures. What they do not conflict on is that WN62's fire into the first waves of the 1st Infantry Division was catastrophic. Sevelow himself, speaking decades later, estimated that he personally may have killed hundreds of men that morning. He was clear that this was an estimate, not a confirmed count. He also said that the weight of that estimate, however uncertain, stayed with him for the rest of his life. The remarkable part is that Sevelow survived. He was one of the exceptions, and the reason exceptions are notable is that they explain the rule. The MG42's rate of fire was its defining characteristic in combat. It gets more complicated from there because that same rate of fire was, under certain conditions, its most significant liability. And the liability did not fall on the gun. It fell on the crew. A barrel firing at 1,200 rounds per minute generates heat at a rate that most metals cannot sustain. The MG42 solved this through a barrel change system that was well engineered by any standard. A trained crew could swap a spent barrel for a fresh one in under 10 seconds. The replacement barrels were carried in insulated metal containers. The locking mechanism was simple enough to operate under fire by a man whose hands were shaking. In theory, this made the gun sustainable for extended fire missions. The reason that theory broke down on June 6th is straightforward. Changing the barrel required exposure. The loader had to reach for the container. The gunner had to release the locking collar, clear the spent barrel, which was hot enough to cause serious burns without the asbestos glove, and seat the replacement. During those seconds, the gun was silent. Silence from a machine gun position that had been tearing the beach apart for several minutes was a signal. American fire teams that were still functioning, still led by officers or NCOs, were trained to recognize that silence as an opportunity. Snipers working the perimeter of those positions were waiting for exactly that moment. The gun went quiet and something moved in the emplacement. That was usually enough. Add to this the muzzle flash. The MG42 at its rate of fire produced a flash signature visible at significant distances even in daylight. The positions had been designed with this in mind: concrete baffles, overhead cover, careful alignment to reduce visibility from the flanks. But in extended fire, the thermal signature and the tracers in the ammunition belts allowed precise location. Naval gunfire observation teams offshore were feeding coordinates back to destroyers. At Omaha, American destroyers eventually closed to within a few hundred meters of the beach, close enough to risk grounding, to direct fire into the bluff positions. Destroyer gunfire at near point-blank range against a concrete emplacement was not surgical. It was brute force. But it did not need to be surgical. It needed to be heavy enough that the men inside had a decision to make: stay in the emplacement and trust the concrete, or move. Both options carried serious costs. The concrete could fail. Moving meant abandoning the position's only protection. The men who moved were often cut down before they reached cover. The men who stayed were often buried. There is another dimension to this that does not receive enough attention in most accounts. The MG42 was the centerpiece of German infantry doctrine, completely, not partially. The riflemen in a German squad were not primarily there to engage the enemy with their rifles. They were there to protect the machine gun, carry its ammunition, suppress threats to its position, and keep the gun firing. The gun was the unit's primary weapon. Everything else was support. Allied forces understood this. The doctrine was known and had been studied, and the tactical response to it was equally clear. Kill the gun first, not the rifleman, not the flanks. The gun. Every soldier who came ashore at Omaha, or who had received any meaningful combat briefing, knew that machine gun nests were the priority targets. Every bar gunner, every rifleman with a viable angle, every mortar team that got established before being overrun, every surviving officer directing fire up the bluff, they were all, to varying degrees, trying to accomplish the same thing. Kill the gun, which meant kill the gunner, which meant, since the doctrine required a minimum 2-man crew and typically ran to 3, kill the entire position. The reason this matters is what it produced on that beach. The concentration of Allied attention on those emplacements was disproportionate to what it would have been against a conventional infantry defense. A German rifleman in a foxhole drew fire from the men directly in front of him. An MG42 position drew fire from everyone who could reach it: mortars, rifles, BARs, destroyers, and eventually, as the perimeter eroded, men with grenades moving close enough to throw them through the aperture. The gun's effectiveness was, in a functional sense, its own death sentence. Every round it fired was evidence of its location. Every man it killed was one more reason for the survivors to direct every available weapon at that position. Sevelo at WN62 survived partly because of the position's construction and partly because of how the assault developed in his sector. The men who eventually cleared WN62 did so after the position had been taking fire for hours, by which point several of the gun crews had already become casualties. The ones at the most exposed positions did not have hours. Some of them had minutes. Military historian Stephen Ambrose documented, drawn from veteran accounts, a specific moment that illustrates what the morning actually looked like from the German side. A machine gunner in one of the bluff positions, firing into the first waves, ran through his first barrel so quickly that the replacement barrel was not properly seated. The gun jammed. The jam took time to clear. In those seconds, a group of American soldiers who had been pinned by that gun's fire crossed 50 meters of open beach they had been unable to cross for 20 minutes. They reached the base of the bluff below the position. The gun crew never cleared the jam in time. The position was overrun within the hour. That is the pattern. Not a single dramatic failure, but a cascade of small ones. A barrel not fully seated. A loader hit while reaching for the ammunition box. A rifleman who was supposed to be covering the left approach who was no longer in position to cover anything. The gun itself was nearly indestructible. The system supporting it was not. And the ammunition consumption at those rates of fire made the math unsustainable in ways that are easy to overlook. It gets worse when you run the numbers. At full cyclic rate, a 250-round belt was gone in approximately 12 seconds. Sustained fire at that rate was not maintainable for hours. It was maintainable for minutes before the logistics of feeding the gun became as dangerous as the gun itself. Loaders moving ammunition through a position under fire. Runners trying to bring additional belts from supply points that were themselves being targeted. When the belts ran short, the gunners had a choice: slow down and conserve, or continue firing while supply lasted, hoping the situation resolved before the ammunition did. Neither option led anywhere useful. The question that appears in nearly every serious account of D-Day is some version of the following. Why did the assault at Omaha not simply fail? The casualty figures, contested, revised, and contextually complicated, represent a level of loss that should have broken the operation. The early waves at Omaha were nearly destroyed. Company A of the 116th Infantry suffered losses that have been compared, in percentage terms, to some of the worst single-unit casualties of the First World War. and yet men kept coming ashore. This is often framed as a matter of courage. It was also, more precisely, a matter of arithmetic. The men behind those MG42 positions were running out of operational capacity faster than the men in front of them were running out of men. Every barrel change was a risk. Every jammed round was a crisis. Every loader who went down was a man who would not be replaced. The Atlantic Wall was formidable. It was not inexhaustible. And the men defending it, many of them not elite German formations but Ost soldiers, Eastern European conscripts of varying training and commitment pressed into German service, were not uniformly prepared to hold those positions to the last round. Some positions held until they were physically destroyed. Others were abandoned before the Americans reached them. The reason the accounting varies so significantly across sectors is that the defense was not uniform in either quality or resolve. The MG42 crews, who stayed in the hardened positions and continued firing, the ones actually executing the defense the Atlantic Wall was designed to provide, paid for it completely. Sevelo walked away from WN62. He spent the remainder of his life attempting to understand how that was possible. What the MG42 left behind at D-Day was not only a casualty count. It reframed the relationship between firepower and survivability in ways that military planners have been working through in the decades since. The gun demonstrated, conclusively, that a single well-placed automatic weapon with a prepared field of fire could hold a position against forces many times larger for longer than conventional calculations would suggest. But the reason that capability came with such severe costs to the crews operating it is built into the same logic. The terrain-integrated, overlapping fire design of the Widerstands Nester was as important as the gun itself. Neither worked without the other. The MG42 in open ground was dangerous. The MG42 in a prepared concrete position with interlocking fields of fire and enfilading angles on the main approach was a different problem entirely. One that could only be resolved by bringing enough fire to bear on the position or by accepting the losses required to reach it at close range. That lesson, that prepared automatic weapon positions require either overwhelming suppression or a willingness to sustain serious losses in the assault, shaped American and British tactical doctrine through the Cold War, through Vietnam, through Iraq and Afghanistan. The specific equipment changed, the underlying physics did not. At close range, volume of fire matters more than almost anything else. The Germans understood this and built their doctrine around it. The MG42 was that doctrine at its most complete expression. The men behind those guns, the gunners who kept firing through the morning of June 6th, who changed barrels under fire and fed belts into the action while their positions came apart around them, were simultaneously the most effective soldiers on that beach and among the most relentlessly targeted. The better a crew performed, the longer they stayed in position. The longer they stayed, the more concentrated the fire they drew. The men who abandoned their positions early had better survival odds. The ones who stayed until the position became untenable often had no odds remaining at all. Heinrich Sevelo's position at WN62 held for hours. The gun he fired that morning is in a museum now. Sevelo lived until 2006. He said once that he would rather have known nothing about what happened on that beach than to have spent 60 years knowing exactly what he had done there. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It is an honest one. If this kind of history is what you are here for, the weapons, the men, the decisions that most accounts move past too quickly, consider subscribing. New videos are posted regularly, and every one of them goes this deep. It costs nothing and it means a great deal.